The telegram sat on Eleanor Hutchins's mahogany desk like a coiled rattlesnake, waiting to strike. She read it again, her fingers trembling slightly as the reality sank deeper into her bones. The ranch in Presidio, Texas, the one her late father had held the lien on for 3 years, had finally gone to auction for back taxes, and her representative had secured it for a fraction of its worth. 2,000 acres of scrubland, a main house, outbuildings, cattle, and according to the brief description, one very surprised former owner who apparently had not vacated the premises. It was May of 1884, and Eleanor had just become a landowner in the wildest corner of West Texas, sight unseen. She stood from her desk in the Boston townhouse, smoothing down her black mourning dress. 6 months had passed since her father's death. 6 months of discovering that his shipping business was drowning in debt, that his assets were scattered across investments that would take years to liquidate, and that his most tangible holding was a remote cattle ranch on the Mexican border that she now owned outright. The lawyers had been clear. She could sell it immediately and recoup her investment, or she could go west and see what could be salvaged. Eleanor had never been one to shy from a challenge, and the suffocating propriety of Boston society had been grinding her spirit to dust since she was old enough to understand that women were expected to ornament drawing rooms rather than make decisions. 2 weeks later, she stepped off the train in Alpine, Texas, her traveling trunks being loaded onto a freight wagon bound for Presidio. The heat hit her like a physical force, dry and relentless, so different from the humid summers back east. The station master, a weathered man with sun-creased eyes, gave her a curious look when she inquired about transportation to Presidio. "That is a hard day's ride, madam," he said, tipping his hat. "You got business down that way?" "I own property there," Eleanor replied, lifting her chin. "The old Everett ranch." His eyebrows rose. "Well now, that is interesting. You are the new owner then. Word travels slow out here, but I heard Owen Everett lost that place. Shame, really. His daddy built that ranch from nothing, and Owen worked it hard as any man could. But drought and bad luck have a way of breaking even the strongest backs." Eleanor felt an uncomfortable twist in her stomach. She had not allowed herself to think much about the man who had lost his home to her gain. Business was business, her father had always said, and sentiment had no place in financial dealings. But standing in the scorching Texas heat, about to travel to a place she could barely imagine, the abstract idea of a dispossessed rancher suddenly felt uncomfortably real. She hired a guide, a taciturn Mexican man named Jesus, who made the Presidio run twice monthly with supplies. They left before dawn the next morning, Eleanor riding in the wagon beside him while 2 other travelers, prospectors heading south, rode their own horses alongside. The landscape unfolded in endless variations of brown and gold, punctuated by hardy mesquite and the occasional lonely homestead. The mountains rose in the distance, purple and mysterious, and the sky stretched overhead in a blue so intense it almost hurt to look at. Jesus spoke little, but when Eleanor asked about the Everett ranch, he opened up slightly. "Senor Owen, he is a good man, fair. He pays what he owes, treats his workers with respect, but the last 3 years have been hard. The drought killed half his herd, and then his father died, and the debts, they piled up. He tried to hold on, worked himself nearly to death trying, but sometimes trying is not enough." "Is he dangerous?" Eleanor asked, suddenly concerned about confronting a desperate man who had lost everything. Jesus shook his head firmly. "No, Senora. Owen Everett is not that kind of man. Proud, yes, stubborn, certainly, but he would not harm a woman. He will be angry, though. A man losing his home, that cuts deep." They arrived at the ranch as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. Eleanor's first glimpse of her new property took her breath away. The main house was a low adobe structure with a deep porch, weathered but solid, built to withstand the harsh climate. Corrals and outbuildings spread out behind it, and in the distance, she could see cattle grazing on the sparse grass. It was rough and raw and beautiful in a way that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. A man emerged from the barn as the wagon rolled to a stop. He was tall and lean, dressed in dusty work clothes, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days' worth of beard shadowing his jaw. He stopped when he saw Eleanor, his hand going to the brim of his hat, his expression shifting from curiosity to confusion to something harder. "Can I help you folks?" he called out. Jessus climbed down from the wagon, speaking in rapid Spanish to the man, who Eleanor assumed must be Owen Everett himself. She watched as understanding dawned on his face, watched his jaw tighten and his eyes go cold. He turned to look at her fully, and Eleanor felt the force of his gaze like a physical touch. "You are the new owner," he said, his voice flat. Eleanor climbed down from the wagon, grateful for her practical traveling dress rather than the elaborate gown society usually demanded. "I am Eleanor Hutchins. My father held the lien on this property. I understand this must be difficult for you, Mr. Everett." "Difficult," he repeated, and a bitter laugh escaped him. "That is one word for it, I suppose." "I was told that the property would be vacant," Eleanor continued, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "My lawyers assured me that all former occupants would have been notified and given time to remove their possessions." Owen's eyes flashed. "Your lawyers sent one telegram to Alpine 3 weeks ago. I have been in the south pasture, dealing with fence repairs and trying to keep what is left of my herd from wandering into Mexico. I got back 2 days ago." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Eleanor could feel Jessus and the prospectors watching, waiting to see how this would unfold. She took a breath, drawing on reserves of composure she had cultivated through years of managing her father's household and navigating Boston's unforgiving social scene. "I see. That is unfortunate. I assume you will need some time to gather your things and make arrangements for your next situation." "My next situation," Owen said, his voice dangerously soft. "You mean after I leave the ranch that my father spent 20 years building, the land I have worked since I was old enough to sit a horse. You are going to give me some time to figure out my next situation." Eleanor felt her own temper beginning to rise. She had not created this man's problems, had not caused the drought or his father's death or his inability to pay his taxes. She was simply the legal owner of property that had been fairly purchased. "I understand you are upset, Mr. Everett, but I am the owner now. I did not make the rules governing property and taxation. I am trying to be reasonable." "Reasonable," he repeated again, shaking his head. "All right then, Miss Hutchins, let me be reasonable too. I have nowhere to go. My cattle are still on this land. My horses are in that barn. My life is here. I will need at least 2 weeks to make arrangements to move the animals and find somewhere to take them. I have been sleeping in the bunkhouse since I got back. You can have the main house. I will stay out of your way." Eleanor considered this. 2 weeks seemed fair, and she would need time to assess the property and determine what to do with it anyway. "Very well. 2 weeks. But I expect you to respect that this is my property now." His eyes met hers, and for a moment something sparked between them, something that was not quite anger but was just as intense. "Oh, I understand perfectly whose property this is now, madam. I will not forget it for a second." He turned and walked back toward the barn, his stride long and purposeful, leaving Eleanor standing in the yard with Jessus and the prospectors. She felt shaken in a way she could not quite name, unsettled by the encounter and by the man himself. She had expected anger, perhaps even hostility, but there had been something else in Owen Everett's eyes, something wounded and fierce and proud that called to something deep within her. Jessus helped her carry her trunks into the main house. The interior was sparsely furnished but clean, the adobe walls keeping the heat at bay. There was a main room with a fireplace, a kitchen area with a cast iron stove, and 2 bedrooms. It was a far cry from her Boston townhouse, but Eleanor found herself oddly charmed by its simplicity. She could make this work. She could build something here. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar place, Eleanor stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the desert. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed. Closer by, she heard the creak of the bunkhouse door. Owen Everett was out there, sleeping in what had been his home until a piece of paper and a gavel had taken it away. She told herself she should not feel guilty. She told herself this was just business. But sleep was a long time coming. The next morning, Eleanor rose with the sun, determined to inspect her property and begin making plans. She dressed in her most practical clothes and stepped out onto the porch to find Owen already at work in the corrals, separating cattle with the help of 2 Mexican ranch hands she had not seen the previous day. He moved with an easy grace on horseback, anticipating the cattle's movements, working in silent coordination with his horse and the other men. Eleanor watched for several minutes, fascinated despite herself by the skill involved. One of the ranch hands noticed her and said something to Owen, who glanced her way briefly before returning his attention to the cattle. When they finished, he rode over to where she stood, his horse blowing hard from the exertion. "Those are the cattle that need to be moved to the east pasture for better grazing," he said without preamble. "The water situation is better over there. I will have it done before I leave." "How many head do you have?" Eleanor asked. "About 250 left. I started with 603 years ago." The loss was staggering. Eleanor had dealt with numbers in her father's business, but somehow the reality of 250 living animals versus 600 made the scale of the drought's devastation real in a way ledgers never could. "I am sorry," she said quietly. Owen's expression hardened. "I do not need your pity, Miss Hutchins. I need to get these animals moved and figure out where I am going to take them when my 2 weeks are up." "I was not offering pity," Eleanor said, her own spine stiffening. "I was offering common human decency, which you seem determined to reject. Common human decency would have been making sure I actually knew I was about to lose my home before you showed up to claim it. I did not conduct the auction myself, Mr. Everett. I was in Boston, burying my father and discovering that his business affairs were in shambles. This ranch was one of the few assets that could actually be recovered. I am not the villain in your story, no matter how much you might want to cast me that way." They stared at each other, tension crackling in the hot morning air. Up close, Eleanor could see that Owen's eyes were a striking gray-blue, the color of storm clouds. She could see the exhaustion etched in lines around those eyes, the toll that years of struggle had taken on a man who could not be much older than her own 25 years. "How old are you?" she asked suddenly. The question seemed to catch him off guard. 28. "Why? You look older." "Tired." Something flickered across his face, too quick to read. "Losing everything ages a man, Miss Hutchins." He turned his horse and rode back toward the corrals, leaving Eleanor standing on the porch feeling oddly chastised and unsettled. She spent the rest of the morning exploring the property on foot, examining the outbuildings, the well, the condition of the fences she could reach easily. Everything was well maintained, but showed signs of deferred repairs, the kind of deterioration that happened when a man was stretched too thin to keep up with everything at once. In the afternoon, she retreated to the house to escape the worst of the heat and began going through the papers she found in the desk, trying to piece together the ranch's history and financial situation. It made for grim reading. Owen had not been exaggerating about the drought and the losses. He had tried everything, taken out loans, sold off land, worked with skeleton crews. But the numbers had been inexorable, and eventually they had crushed him. That evening, she prepared a simple meal for herself and sat on the porch as the sun set, watching the sky turn from gold to crimson to deep purple. She saw Owen emerge from the bunkhouse and head to the well, where he stripped off his shirt and washed the day's dust from his skin. Eleanor knew she should look away, that watching him was improper, but she found herself unable to tear her gaze from the sight. His body was lean and muscular, hardened by years of physical labor, and there was something almost beautiful about the unself-conscious way he moved. He glanced up suddenly and caught her watching. For a moment their eyes locked, and Eleanor felt heat flood her face that had nothing to do with the Texas sun. Owen grabbed his shirt and pulled it back on, then disappeared into the bunkhouse without a word. Eleanor sat frozen, her heart pounding, feeling like she had been caught doing something far more intimate than simply watching a man wash at a well. The next few days fell into an uneasy pattern. Owen worked the ranch from dawn until dusk, often with the two hands, occasionally alone. Eleanor explored the property, rode out on one of the gentler horses to see the full extent of her land, and began making lists of what needed to be done. They spoke rarely and only when necessary, maintaining a careful distance that felt both appropriate and increasingly strained. On the fourth day, Eleanor rode out to the east pasture where Owen was working on a water trough. She had questions about the cattle, about which animals were breeding stock and which could be sold, and she needed his expertise whether either of them liked it or not. He looked up as she approached, wariness in his eyes. "Miss Hutchins." "I need your knowledge, Mr. Everett," she said bluntly. "I intend to keep this ranch operating, but I know nothing about cattle or ranching. I need you to teach me." He straightened slowly, wiping his hands on his pants. "You are planning to stay, to run this place yourself?" "I have nowhere else to go either," Eleanor said, the admission costing her more than she expected. "My father's estate is bankrupt. This ranch is all I have left." Understanding flickered in Owen's eyes and some of the hardness in his expression eased. "I did not realize." "Why would you? I did not advertise my circumstances." She paused, gathering her courage for what she needed to say next. "I will pay you to stay on and teach me what I need to know." "Not as the owner, but as my foreman. The wages would not be much, but you would have a place to live and work until you got back on your feet." Owen stared at her, clearly stunned by the offer. "You want me to work for you, to work my own ranch as your employee?" "I want you to help me keep this ranch from failing the way it failed you," Eleanor said. "You know this land, these animals, this work. I do not. Without you, I will likely lose everything just as you did. With you, maybe we both have a chance." The silence stretched out between them, heavy with the weight of the decision. Eleanor could see the conflict playing out across Owen's face, pride warring with practicality, anger fighting with something that might have been hope. "Why would you do this?" he asked finally. "After the way I have treated you. Because I need help and you need work, and maybe we can both stop being so stubborn about who wronged whom and focus on keeping this ranch alive." She met his eyes steadily. "I am not your enemy, Owen Everett. I am just a woman trying to survive, same as you." He turned away, looking out over the land that had been his and now was hers, his jaw working. When he finally turned back, something had shifted in his expression. The hostility had not disappeared entirely, but it had been joined by something else, something that looked almost like respect. "All right," he said. "I will stay on as your foreman, but I have conditions." "Name them." "I make the decisions about the cattle and the land management. You can learn and ask questions, but when it comes to the actual ranching work, my word is final. I will not watch this place run into the ground by someone who does not know what they are doing." Eleanor bristled slightly but recognized the sense in his demand. "Agreed. What else?" "I keep my own quarters in the bunkhouse. We maintain a professional relationship. And when I have saved enough money, I will buy back this ranch from you at fair market value." The last condition surprised her, but she nodded. "Agreed. I will draw up a contract when we get back to the house." Owen held out his hand and Eleanor took it. His palm was rough with calluses, his grip firm and warm. The handshake lasted a moment longer than strictly necessary, and when they released each other, Eleanor felt the phantom impression of his touch lingering on her skin. They rode back to the ranch house together, and for the first time, Owen spoke to her without the edge of bitterness that had characterized all their previous interactions. He told her about the ranch's history, about his father's dream of building something lasting in this harsh land, about the good years before the drought when the cattle numbered in the thousands and the ranch turned a solid profit. "We used to have 12 men working here year-round," he said. "Now it is just Marco and Jessus, and they only stay because they are loyal beyond what any man deserves. I have not been able to pay them properly in 6 months." "That will change," Eleanor said firmly. "Once I see the books and understand the financial situation, paying the hands will be the first priority." Owen glanced at her with something that might have been approval. "You sound like you know business." "I managed my father's household accounts for years, and I helped with the shipping business when he would let me. I am not ignorant of finances, Mr. Everett, just of cattle." "Owen," he said suddenly, "if we are going to work together, you might as well call me Owen." "Mr. Everett was my father." "Eleanor," she replied, feeling the strangeness and intimacy of the exchange. "My friends call me Ellie, but Eleanor is fine." "Eleanor," he repeated, and the way he said her name in his low voice sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table and went over the ranch accounts together, Eleanor's head for figures complementing Owen's knowledge of the operation. It became quickly apparent that the ranch could be viable again with careful management and some luck with the weather. The cattle that remained were good breeding stock, and there was a ready market in the growing towns to the north for beef. "If we can make it through the next 2 years without another disaster, we could be profitable," Eleanor said, running calculations in the margin of the ledger. "It will require careful budgeting and probably some additional investment, but it is possible." Owen leaned back in his chair, a strange expression on his face. "You really mean to do this, to stay here and make this work? Did you think I was lying?" "I thought you were a city woman playing at being a rancher, that you would last maybe a month before running back east." "I might surprise you," Eleanor said, meeting his eyes. "I have discovered that I am capable of far more than anyone ever expected of me, including myself." Something warm flickered in Owen's eyes, there and gone like a spark. "I am beginning to see that." The days that followed were a revelation for Eleanor. Owen taught her everything, patient despite his initial reluctance, showing her how to read the cattle, how to assess the water situation, how to predict where the animals would drift. She learned to ride properly, not the sedate walks of Boston parks, but the hard riding necessary for ranch work. Her hands blistered and her muscles ached, and she had never felt more alive. Marco and Jessus, Once they understood that Eleanor intended to pay them properly and keep the ranch operating, warmed to her quickly. Marco's wife, Rosa, came to help with the heavier housework and cooking, her cheerful presence filling the adobe house with life and laughter. Eleanor found herself settling into a routine that felt more natural than anything she had known in Boston. Owen remained somewhat distant, maintaining the professional boundaries he had insisted upon, but Eleanor caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she could not quite read. When she mastered a new skill or handled a difficult situation well, she saw approval in his eyes, and that approval began to matter to her more than she wanted to admit. 3 weeks after she had arrived, a storm rolled in from the west, the first real rain they had seen in months. Eleanor stood on the porch watching the clouds build, marveling at the violence and beauty of a desert thunderstorm. Owen appeared beside her, equally transfixed by the approaching weather. "This could save us," he said quietly. "If it rains enough, if it breaks the drought, the grass will come back. The cattle will have enough to eat. We might actually make it." The first drops began to fall, fat and heavy, and then the heavens opened. Rain poured down in sheets, drumming on the roof and turning the dusty yard to mud within minutes. Eleanor laughed with pure joy, stepping off the porch into the deluge, tilting her face up to the sky and letting the water wash over her. Owen followed her, and when she looked at him, he was smiling, really smiling, and the transformation was breathtaking. The hardness that had defined him since she arrived melted away, leaving a man who was younger and lighter and impossibly handsome. Their eyes met through the rain, and suddenly the space between them felt charged with more than just the electricity of the storm. "Eleanor," he said, and the way he said her name now was different from before, rougher and more intimate. She took a step toward him, drawn by something she did not fully understand, and then Marco was shouting from the barn about a leak in the roof, and the moment shattered. They spent the next hour dealing with the crisis, working side by side to move equipment and bail water, and by the time everything was secured, the immediacy of whatever had passed between them had faded into something more uncertain. But Eleanor could not forget the way Owen had looked at her in the rain, could not shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between them. She found herself increasingly aware of him, of the way he moved, the sound of his voice, the rare moments when he laughed at something Marco said. She told herself it was foolish, that any romantic entanglement between them would be disastrous for a dozen reasons, but her heart seemed disinclined to listen to reason. The rain continued intermittently for 3 days, and when it finally cleared, the land had transformed. Green shoots appeared seemingly overnight, and the cattle grew visibly fatter and more content. The water holes filled, and the creek that ran through the eastern section of the property flowed with actual water instead of just a trickle. Hope, long absent from the ranch, began to take root and grow. One evening, about a month after Eleanor's arrival, she and Owen sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset. It had become a habit, this quiet end to the day when they would discuss the next day's work or simply sit in companionable silence. The professional distance Owen had insisted on had eroded gradually, replaced by something that felt almost like friendship. "I need to ask you something," Eleanor said, breaking the comfortable quiet. "Why did your father take out the loan from my father's company? What happened that you needed that money?" Owen was quiet for a long moment. "My father had a heart condition. He hid it for years, but eventually it got bad enough that he needed to see a specialist in San Antonio. The medical bills were enormous. We took out the loan to cover them and to keep the ranch running while he was sick." He paused, his voice going rough. "He died anyway, 6 months after the loan came through." "I am sorry," Eleanor said softly. "My father never mentioned any of that in his papers. You were just a number in a ledger to him. And I was supposed to be just a problem to solve for you," Owen said, turning to look at her. "But you are not what I expected, Eleanor Hutchins. What did you expect? Someone cold. Someone who saw this place and the people on it as just assets to be managed. But you care. You genuinely care about making this work, about the people here. You have worked harder in the past month than any society woman I could have imagined." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "I have nothing to go back to. This is my life now, my home. Of course I care about it." "It is more than that," Owen said, his eyes intense in the fading light. "You could have sold this place, taken the money, and figured something else out. But you chose to stay to fight for it. That takes courage." "Or desperation," Eleanor said with a slight smile. "No," Owen said firmly. "Courage." Their eyes held, and Eleanor felt her breath catch. The air between them felt thick with possibility, with all the things they had not said over the past weeks. She wanted to lean closer, wanted to know if the pull she felt toward him was reciprocated, but before she could move, Owen stood abruptly. "I should check on the horses before bed," he said, his voice slightly rough. "Good night, Eleanor." He was gone before she could respond, leaving her alone on the porch with her racing heart and the growing certainty that what she felt for Owen Everett was far more than simple attraction or gratitude. She was falling in love with him, with his strength and his stubborn pride and the gentleness he showed to the animals and the quiet competence with which he did everything. It was reckless and complicated and probably doomed, but it was also undeniable. The next day, a rider came from town with news that a herd buyer would be passing through the area in 2 weeks, looking for cattle to drive north. It was an opportunity to sell off some of their stock at good prices and bring in much-needed cash. Owen immediately began the process of selecting which animals to sell, explaining to Eleanor how to evaluate the cattle and choose the ones that would bring the best prices while preserving their breeding program. They worked closely together over the following days, often riding side by side through the pastures, their legs occasionally brushing as their horses moved together. Every accidental touch felt electric to Eleanor, and she began to notice signs that Owen was equally affected. She caught him watching her with an intensity that made her skin flush, saw the way his jaw tightened when she laughed at something Marco said, noticed how he always seemed to position himself between her and any potential danger. A week before the buyer was scheduled to arrive, Eleanor was helping Owen separate cattle in the main corral when one of the steers, spooked by something, charged directly at her. She froze for a crucial second, and then Owen was there, his horse cutting between her and the steer, turning the animal away at the last moment. The steer veered off, but the close call left Eleanor shaking. Owen dismounted quickly and was at her side in an instant, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Are you all right? Eleanor, are you hurt?" "I am fine," she managed, though her voice trembled. "Just startled." "You froze," he said, his voice tight with an emotion she could not quite identify. "When an animal charges, you have to move. You could have been killed." "I know, I did not expect it." Owen's hands tightened on her shoulders, and suddenly the space between them evaporated. His eyes were blazing with intensity, with fear transmuted into something else, something that stole Eleanor's breath. "I cannot lose you," he said hoarsely. "Do you understand? I cannot lose you." "Owen," she whispered, and then his mouth was on hers, fierce and desperate and perfect. Eleanor melted into the kiss, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, all the weeks of tension and unspoken feeling pouring out in that single moment. Owen kissed her like a man dying of thirst, like she was air and water and everything he needed. When they finally broke apart, Both breathing hard, his forehead came to rest against hers. "This is a terrible idea," he said, but his hands were gentle on her face, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones. "Probably," Eleanor agreed, her eyes still closed, savoring the feeling of being held by him. "Does that mean we should stop?" "I do not think I could stop even if I wanted to," Owen admitted. "Eleanor, I have been fighting this for weeks. Fighting how I feel about you, telling myself it was impossible that you were my employer, that you owned everything I had lost. But I cannot fight it anymore." Eleanor opened her eyes and found his gaze waiting for her, vulnerable in a way she had never seen him. "I have been falling in love with you since the day you stood in the rain and smiled," she said softly. "Maybe before that. Maybe since the first moment I saw you and thought you were the most compelling man I had ever met, even angry and covered in dust." "You are in love with me?" Owen asked, wonder in his voice. "Hopelessly," Eleanor confirmed and kissed him again, slower this time, savoring it. When they finally separated, Marco was watching from the fence, a knowing smile on his weathered face. He called out something in Spanish that made Owen laugh, and Eleanor blushed despite not understanding the words. "He says it is about time," Owen translated, his arm coming around her waist. "He and Rosa have been placing bets on how long it would take us to figure it out." "Have they now?" Eleanor said, laughing despite her embarrassment. "And who won?" "Rosa. She said 3 weeks. Marco thought it would take 2 months." They finished the work with the cattle, but everything felt different now, charged with the new understanding between them. That evening, instead of retiring to the bunkhouse, Owen stayed in the main house, and they sat together on the porch with her tucked against his side, his arm around her shoulders. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "I do not know," Owen admitted. "This is complicated. You own this ranch. You are technically my employer. There will be talk." "Let them talk," Eleanor said firmly. "I have spent my entire life worrying about what people thought, about following rules that were designed to keep women in their place. I am done with that. I love you, Owen Everett. If that scandalizes people, that is their problem, not mine." Owen pressed a kiss to her temple. "You are remarkable, do you know that? You make me feel remarkable," Eleanor said. "You make me feel like I can be the person I always wanted to be but never dared." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Owen said, "I want to court you properly. I know the circumstances are unusual, but I want to do this right. I want everyone to know that I am serious about you, that this is not just some passing fancy." Eleanor turned in his arms to face him. "I would like that. Though I should warn you, I have no interest in a long engagement. I have waited long enough to find something real." "How does 3 months sound?" Owen asked, his eyes twinkling. "Long enough to be respectable, short enough that I do not go mad." "Perfect," Eleanor said, and sealed it with a kiss. The next few weeks were the happiest of Eleanor's life. She and Owen worked together during the day and spent their evenings on the porch or taking walks around the property, talking about everything and nothing, learning each other's histories and dreams. The cattle sale went well, bringing in enough money to pay off the remaining debts and provide a cushion for improvements. The ranch was finally, truly on solid footing. Rosa took Eleanor under her wing, teaching her to cook the foods Owen loved and sharing advice about men in general and stubborn cowboys in particular. Marco teased Owen mercilessly about being domesticated, but Eleanor could see the genuine happiness in the older man's eyes. The ranch felt like a home now, filled with warmth and laughter and purpose. 2 months after their first kiss, Owen took Eleanor into Presidio for supplies. It was her first real visit to the town, and she was charmed by the dusty streets and friendly people. Several ranchers and merchants approached Owen to welcome him back, and congratulate him on the ranch's recovery. Eleanor noticed that he introduced her as his fiancée with obvious pride, and she felt her heart swell. At the general store, Owen bought her a simple gold ring, nothing fancy but beautiful in its simplicity. He slipped it onto her finger right there in the store, and the proprietor's wife clapped her hands in delight and insisted on opening a bottle of wine to celebrate. "I wish I could give you diamonds and fancy things," Owen said later as they drove the supply wagon back toward the ranch. "This ring is worth more to me than all the diamonds in the world," Eleanor said honestly. "It represents everything we have built together, everything we have overcome. It is perfect." In early August, 3 months to the day after Eleanor had kissed Owen in the rain, they were married by the circuit preacher in a simple ceremony at the ranch. Rosa decorated the porch with wildflowers, and Marco stood up as Owen's best man. The few neighboring ranchers and the families from town who had become friends attended. And afterward, there was a celebration with music and dancing and more food than Eleanor had ever seen in one place. Eleanor wore a simple white dress that Rosa had helped her make, nothing like the elaborate gown she might have worn in Boston, but she felt more beautiful than she ever had in her life. When Owen took her hand and spoke his vows, his voice thick with emotion, she knew that she had found something she had never even known to look for, a love that was fierce and true and built on mutual respect and partnership. Their wedding night was tender and passionate, a revelation for Eleanor, who had been taught that physical intimacy was a duty to be endured rather than a joy to be celebrated. Owen was patient and gentle and thorough, and when she fell asleep in his arms hours later, she felt complete in a way she had never imagined possible. The next year was not without challenges. A late summer storm damaged some of the outbuildings and required expensive repairs. One of their best bulls died from a snake bite, a significant loss. But through everything, Eleanor and Owen faced the problems together, their partnership strengthening with each obstacle they overcame. In the spring of 1885, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. Owen's joy was almost overwhelming, and he became even more protective, insisting that she not do any heavy work and hovering anxiously whenever she so much as looked tired. Eleanor tolerated his concern with amusement, continuing to manage the ranch's books and make plans for the future even as her belly grew round. Their son was born in December, during a rare cold snap that left frost on the ground in the mornings. The labor was long and difficult, with only Rosa to help, and there were moments when Eleanor feared she would not survive. But when she finally held her son, a squalling red-faced bundle with his father's dark hair, every moment of pain became worthwhile. They named him James, after Owen's father, and watching Owen with their son made Eleanor fall in love with him all over again. He was tender and careful, marveling at the tiny fingers and toes, walking the floor at night when James cried so Eleanor could rest. She would wake to find them together in the rocking chair, Owen singing soft lullabies in his rumbling voice, and her heart would feel so full she thought it might burst. The ranch continued to prosper. With careful management and a return to normal rainfall, the herd grew steadily. They hired more hands as the work increased, and the bunkhouse was expanded to accommodate them. Owen proved to be as good a leader as he was a rancher, fair but firm, earning the loyalty of the men who worked for him. When James was 2 years old, Eleanor became pregnant again, and this time she delivered a daughter they named Catherine. She had Eleanor's light hair and Owen's gray-blue eyes, and she was the apple of her father's eye from the moment he first held her. James, no longer the baby, took his role as big brother seriously, always wanting to help with his sister. By 1890, the ranch had become one of the most successful operations in the region. Eleanor's business acumen combined with Owen's ranching expertise made them a formidable team. They had paid off all debts, expanded their land holdings, and built a reputation for quality cattle. The adobe house had been expanded and improved, though they kept its essential character, and it was filled with the sounds of family and life. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard, Owen pulled Eleanor close and said, "Do you remember what I said the day you hired me? That I would buy this ranch back from you someday?" "I remember," Eleanor said, smiling at the memory of how far they had come since that tense negotiation. "I do not want to buy it back," Owen said. "This is ours, not mine or yours but ours. We built this together. You saved this place when I could not, and then you gave me the chance to save it with you. I do not think I ever properly thanked you for that." "You thank me every day," Eleanor said, leaning into his warmth. "Every time you look at me like I am precious, every time you make me laugh, every time you hold our children. You thank me by being the man you are." "I love you, Eleanor Everett," Owen said, using her married name in the way he knew she loved. "I will love you until the day I die and beyond." "And I love you," Eleanor replied. "My stubborn, wonderful cowboy who was sleeping in a bunkhouse the day I arrived and who stole my heart before I even knew I was giving it away." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over land that had tested them and shaped them and ultimately brought them together. Eleanor thought about the frightened woman who had stepped off the train in Alpine more than 6 years ago, about how lost and uncertain she had been. That woman seemed like a stranger now. She had found herself in the West Texas desert, had found her strength and her purpose and her love. James came running up to the porch, demanding that his father come see something, and Owen rose with a laugh, allowing himself to be dragged away. Catherine toddled after them, calling for her papa, and Eleanor watched her family with a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. In 1892, their third child arrived, another son they named Thomas. The house rang with noise and laughter and the controlled chaos of 3 small children. Eleanor, who had once managed a quiet Boston townhouse, now ruled over a ranching empire and a lively family with equal competence and considerably more joy. The years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the milestones of their growing children. There were hard times still, years when the market was bad or the weather did not cooperate, but Eleanor and Owen faced them together, their partnership unshakable. They had built something that would last, not just a successful ranch but a legacy of love and resilience. On their 10th anniversary, Owen surprised Eleanor with a trip to San Antonio, their first time away from the ranch and children for more than a day. They stayed in a fine hotel and ate in restaurants and walked through the city streets like the young couple they still were at heart. On their last evening, as they danced in the hotel ballroom, Owen pulled her close and whispered in her ear, "You ever regret it, staying in Texas, marrying a cowboy, choosing this life?" Eleanor pulled back enough to look him in the eyes. "Not for a single second. This life, this ranch, you and our children, this is everything I ever wanted even when I did not know I wanted it. You gave me freedom and purpose and love. How could I ever regret that?" "I am the one who should be grateful," Owen said. "You saved me, Eleanor, not just the ranch but me. I was drowning in bitterness and loss, and you threw me a lifeline. You gave me back my home and my hope and a future I had thought was lost." "We saved each other," Eleanor said softly. "That is what love does. It saves us from our worst selves and makes us into our best selves." They danced until the music stopped, and then they went upstairs to their room and made love with the comfortable passion of long intimacy, their bodies knowing each other as well as their hearts did. When they returned to the ranch, they were greeted by chaos. James, now 11, had apparently decided to try breaking a horse by himself and had ended up in the water trough. Catherine, 8 years old and already showing signs of being a formidable horsewoman, had won a riding contest against boys twice her age. Thomas, at 3, had learned a collection of colorful phrases from the ranch hands that made Rosa gasp and Eleanor hide her laughter. Life settled back into its familiar patterns. Eleanor managed the business side of the ranch with an expertise that made her one of the most respected figures in regional cattle circles, despite being a woman. Owen ran the actual ranching operations, training their children in the same skills his father had taught him. Together, they made decisions about everything from breeding programs to land purchases, a true partnership in every sense. In 1895, tragedy struck when a fire in the barn killed several horses and nearly spread to the house. They lost valuable animals and equipment, and the financial hit was significant. But they rebuilt, the community coming together to help as they had been helped over the years. It was a reminder that success was never guaranteed, that the land could be as harsh as it was beautiful. But it was also a reminder of everything they had built together. As Eleanor and Owen stood in the ashes of the barn, his arm around her shoulders and her head on his chest, she felt not despair but determination. They had overcome worse. They would overcome this too, and they did. Within a year, a new barn stood, larger and better designed than the old one. The herd had continued to grow, and the children were becoming capable helpers. James showed a particular aptitude for working with horses, while Catherine had inherited Eleanor's head for numbers and loved helping with the books. Thomas was still young but already displaying his father's stubborn determination. By the turn of the century, the ranch was firmly established as one of the premier operations in West Texas. Eleanor and Owen had achieved something remarkable, not just financial success, but a real legacy. They employed dozens of people. Their cattle were known for quality throughout the region, and their children were growing into fine young people who understood both the value of hard work and the importance of treating people fairly. One evening in 1900, as they celebrated their 15th anniversary with their children and extended ranch family, Eleanor looked around at everything they had built and felt a profound sense of gratitude. The scared woman who had arrived with nothing but a deed and determination had built an empire. The bitter man who had been sleeping in a bunkhouse, dispossessed of everything, had reclaimed his legacy and built something even greater. But more than the success, more than the land or the cattle or the money in the bank, what mattered was the love they shared. The partnership they had forged in adversity had only strengthened with time. They still made each other laugh, still sought each other's counsel, still came together at the end of each day to share the quiet moments on the porch where their story had truly begun. James was preparing to go to college, planning to study agriculture so he could bring new techniques back to the ranch. Catherine had announced her intention to become the first female cattle buyer in Texas, and Eleanor had no doubt she would succeed. Thomas was talking about breeding horses, seeing a future in the animals he loved. Each of them would find their own path, but they would always have the ranch as their foundation, the place where they learned what it meant to work hard and love fiercely and never give up. As the new century dawned, Eleanor and Owen stood together on their porch, watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. They were older now, silver threading through Owen's dark hair and lines marking Eleanor's face, but their hands were still clasped together, their connection as strong as ever. "What are you thinking?" Owen asked, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "That I am the luckiest woman alive," Eleanor said honestly. That I took the biggest risk of my life coming here, and it gave me everything I ever wanted. I am the lucky one, Owen countered. You bought my ranch at auction, showed up and turned my world upside down, and somehow I ended up with more than I ever lost. I got you and our children and a life I never thought I would have. You are the best investment anyone ever made, Eleanor Everett. Eleanor laughed and turned into his arms, resting her head on his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. We are both lucky then. Lucky we found each other. Lucky we were both stubborn enough to make this work. Lucky that love was stronger than pride or circumstance. To luck then, Owen said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, and to love, and to the next 50 years of our life together. To forever, Eleanor whispered, and knew that she meant it. The years continued to unfold, bringing joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge, but through everything, Eleanor and Owen faced life together. They grew old side by side, their love deepening and maturing like fine wine. They saw their children marry and have children of their own, the ranch passing to the next generation while they took on the role of beloved grandparents. On their 30th anniversary, their children threw them a celebration that brought together everyone whose lives they had touched over the decades. Ranchers and townspeople, former ranch hands and current employees, friends and family gathered to honor the couple who had become pillars of the community. Stories were told of Eleanor's arrival, of Owen's initial hostility, of how their unlikely partnership had become the greatest love story the region had ever known. As Eleanor sat beside Owen that evening, surrounded by the evidence of their life together, she reflected on the improbable journey that had brought them here. She had arrived in Texas with nothing but determination and a deed, had found a cowboy sleeping in what had been his bunkhouse, and somehow, impossibly, had found her home. Not just in the land or the ranch, but in the man beside her, in the family they had created, in the life they had built from desperation and courage and love. Owen leaned over and whispered in her ear, "Do you remember the day you offered me that job? When you said maybe we could both stop being stubborn and focus on keeping the ranch alive?" "I remember," Eleanor said, smiling at the memory. "Best decision I ever made saying yes," Owen said. "Second best was kissing you after that steer nearly trampled you. Only second best." Eleanor teased. "First best was asking you to marry me," Owen clarified. "Though to be fair, you did not give me much choice. You had already stolen my heart by then." "I bought your ranch," Eleanor said, the old joke familiar and comfortable between them. "I got your heart as a bonus." "Best bonus ever given," Owen said, and kissed her there in front of everyone, to the cheers and applause of their assembled loved ones. They lived to see the ranch thrive under their children's management, to hold great-grandchildren, to celebrate 50 years of marriage surrounded by a family that numbered in the dozens. Eleanor lived to be 83, sharp and opinionated to the end, still managing to give advice about the ranch finances even when her body had grown frail. Owen held her hand as she slipped away peacefully one spring morning, the windows open to let in the desert air she had grown to love. He followed her less than a year later, unable or unwilling to face life without his Eleanor. They were buried together on a hill overlooking the ranch, their graves marked by simple stones that bore their names and the years of their lives and one simple phrase: "Together forever." The ranch continued for generations after them, a testament to what they had built. But more than the land or the success, their legacy was the story they left behind, the tale of a desperate woman and a dispossessed cowboy who found each other in the hardest of circumstances and built something beautiful. It was a story told and retold, becoming part of the region's folklore, a reminder that love could grow in the harshest soil, That partnership could overcome any obstacle, and that sometimes the greatest fortunes were found not in what you gained, but in who you found along the way. In the ranch house that Eleanor had made her own, and then made into a home, in the bunkhouse where Owen had slept that first night after losing everything, in the corrals and pastures and endless desert sky, their presence lingered like a blessing. Every sunset, every rainstorm, every spring calf born, and every honest day's work done carried the echo of what they had created together. They had taken broken pieces and made something whole, had taken loss and created abundance, had taken two wounded hearts and forged a love that time itself could not diminish. And on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the mesquite and the stars blazed overhead in the vast Texas sky, you could almost hear the echo of their voices on the porch, the low rumble of Owen's laugh and the bright sound of Eleanor's reply, still there in the place where they had learned to love, where they had built their forever, where a cowboy sleeping in a bunkhouse had found his home again in the heart of the woman who had bought his ranch and given him back his life. Their story was complete, a circle closed, a journey finished, and it was perfect.